Scandal at the airport. An orphan child, excited to meet his idol Cristiano Ronaldo, is heartbreakingly abandoned by a heartless airline. Through tears, he watches as his dream falls apart, until Ronaldo himself, furious, storms into the airport. What did the football star say? Who will pay for this? What happened will leave you speechless. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Pedro rushed through the airport terminal. His hand gripped the ticket tightly, as if he feared it would vanish at any moment. His backpack was barely heavy, but he felt like it carried everything important: a couple of t-shirts, his toothbrush, and the letter he had written for Cristiano Ronaldo. The thought of seeing his idol in person made his heart race. When he reached the airline counter, he looked up with a smile. He extended his passport and ticket with both hands. The employee, a man with an angular face and a blue uniform, took them without haste. His expression shifted from indifference to suspicion in a matter of seconds. "Pedro Oliveira?" he read quietly, raising an eyebrow. Pedro nodded enthusiastically. He couldn't wait to board that plane. The man slid the passport through the reader, checked it, and then frowned. He opened it, closed it, and opened it again. His eyes locked onto the photo, then onto Pedro, back to the photo. His lips twisted into a doubtful grimace. Pedro felt a chill run down his spine. His excitement began to waver. The man typed something on the computer. Then he repeated the process with exasperating slowness. Every passing second felt like an eternity. The line behind Pedro started to grow, and some people murmured impatiently. "Is something wrong?" Pedro asked, trying to sound calm. The employee didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked him up and down, as if assessing him. Finally, he exhaled heavily and snapped the passport shut. "Where are your parents?" he asked in a dry tone. Pedro blinked. "I don't have parents." The man clenched his jaw. "Who bought you this ticket?" Pedro swallowed hard. "Cristiano Ronaldo's foundation gave it to me. It's for the event in Lisbon." The employee didn't seem convinced. His fingers tapped impatiently on the keyboard. Then he picked up the phone and murmured something into the receiver. Pedro couldn't hear what he was saying, but the tone of his voice unsettled him. The joy he had felt upon arriving at the airport was crumbling piece by piece. Something was wrong, and he had no idea how to fix it. The employee looked away from Pedro and leaned toward his colleague, murmuring something in a low voice. Pedro tried to catch a word, but he only picked up scattered fragments. With each passing second, the knot in his stomach tightened. He looked around, searching for support, but no one seemed to pay him any attention. Finally, the supervisor turned to him with a neutral expression. "You can't board," he said bluntly. Pedro felt a blow to his chest. "Why?" His voice sounded weaker than he wanted. "There's a problem with your documentation," the man responded, avoiding his gaze. Pedro frowned. "But everything is in order. It's an official ticket. Cristiano Ronaldo's foundation sent it." The supervisor remained unmoved. He only gave a slight nod, and the previous employee turned the computer screen to show him. Pedro tried to lean in to see what it was about, but the movement was too quick. The screen was turned away before he could read anything. "What problem?" Pedro insisted, his voice trembling. "We can't give you more information," the supervisor said dryly. Then he turned to the next passenger, dismissing him as if he didn't exist. Pedro clenched his fists. Helplessness mixed with fear. A soft murmur rippled through the line of passengers. "Poor kid," someone whispered, but no one stepped forward. No one did anything. Pedro swallowed hard. He felt like his voice carried no weight in that place, as if he were invisible. But he wouldn't give up. Not now. Pedro felt his chest tighten. Everything he had dreamed of, everything he had longed for, was beginning to crumble in his mind. There would be no event, no meeting with his hero. Only the cold reality of that airport, where no one seemed to care about what he was feeling. Tears began to well up in his eyes before he could hold them back. The ticket was bought by Ronaldo's foundation, he explained with a choked voice. His desperation was evident, but the employees barely blinked. "I'm sorry, kid, but we can't make exceptions," one of them said without the slightest hint of empathy. Pedro clung to his last hope. He opened his backpack with trembling hands, searching for the paper that confirmed everything. He knew it was there. He knew he just had to show it and everything would change. But his fingers slipped over the material. The letter slipped from his grasp and fell to the ground, floating in the air for a few seconds before landing face down. Pedro froze. No one moved to help him. All that remained was a boy and a shattered dream on the floor of an airport. Pedro extended the letter with both hands, clinging to it as if it were his last hope. The supervisor took it unhurriedly, unfolded it, and read it quickly. His eyes scanned the lines with an impassive expression before his fingers returned it, without even looking at him. "That doesn't change anything," he said coldly. Pedro felt a knot in his stomach. Of course, it changed everything. But they didn't want to listen. His breathing quickened as he searched for the right words. His voice sounded broken when he tried to speak. "Please, this ticket was paid for by Ronaldo's foundation. I'm not lying. I just want to get to the event." The employees exchanged glances. No one said anything. No one bothered to explain. It was as if he no longer existed to them. Pedro opened his mouth to insist, but a harsh voice interrupted him. "Stop making a scene, kid," a man in the line grumbled. "There are more people waiting." Pedro turned, searching for support in the passengers' faces. He only found impatience and indifference. No one was on his side. He was a nuisance, a problem no one wanted to solve. The boy swallowed hard and lowered his head. His hands tightened around the crumpled letter. He felt the weight of the stares piercing his skin, judging him, discarding him. The murmur of the line resumed its normal rhythm. To them, he no longer existed. Pedro looked around desperately. He knew that if someone spoke for him, if someone simply said something, everything could change. His eyes met those of a woman in the line. She watched him for a moment, her expression showing doubt, as if she were about to say something. Pedro felt a flicker of hope. But then, the airline employee looked at her with annoyance. She blinked, shrugged, and turned her gaze to her phone, as if nothing was happening. Pedro felt a lump in his throat. Once again, he was alone. The loudspeaker announced the start of boarding. One by one, the passengers moved forward, handing over their tickets, crossing the gate, and heading to the plane. Pedro felt time slipping away. He couldn't just stand there. His chance, his dream, was vanishing before him. Then, without thinking twice, he ran. He dashed toward the boarding gate, dodging a flight attendant who tried to stop him. His feet pounded against the floor, his breath was ragged, but he didn't care. He was just a few meters away when a firm hand grabbed his arm. "Stop right there," a deep voice said. Pedro tried to break free, but the security guard didn't let go. He pulled him back gently, yet with enough strength to hold him in place. Pedro struggled, kicked, but he had no chance. His gaze lifted, and he saw the door slowly closing. "Please, let me get on," he shouted with all his might, but no one responded. The guard shook his head. "I'm sorry, kid, but you can't board." The sound of the plane preparing for departure filled the air. Pedro felt the air leave his chest. His legs trembled, and his arms fell to his sides. Everything was lost. The door closes with an electronic beep. Pedro blinks, dazed. He sees the aircraft through the glass, motionless on the runway for a few seconds, as if he still had a chance to do something. But then, the plane begins to move. slowly at first, then faster. His chest tightens. Something inside him breaks. He can't move. He can't breathe. His crumpled ticket is still in his hand, though it's useless now. The sound of the turbine echoes in his ears as he watches the plane lift off, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. There's no turning back. No second chance. He has been left behind. The boarding area is almost empty. Only a few employees and scattered passengers, none of them looking at him. No one seems to realize that Pedro's world has just collapsed. He lets himself fall into one of the chairs by the window, his eyes fixed on the sky. His reflection in the glass stares back at him, small, lost. He lowers his gaze to his Ronaldo shirt. It's dirty, worn out, but still his most valuable possession. His fingers clutch the fabric tightly. He strokes it, feeling every crease, every loose thread. He remembers when he got it. It was the only thing he had from him, from his idol. His only connection to someone he admired. Now, the only thing he has left. He hugs himself, rubbing the fabric between his fingers, as if he could find some comfort in it. But the emptiness is still there. The disappointment is still there. His body trembles, though he doesn't know if it's from the cold or from sorrow. He doesn't know what to do now. He doesn't know where to go. The only thing he knows is that he is alone. Pedro remains seated in the boarding area, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. Rage and sadness swirled inside him, forming a knot in his throat. His Ronaldo shirt was crumpled between his fingers, as if clinging to it could give him back some control over his fate. Beside him, a boy his age, dressed in immaculate clothes and carrying a brand-name suitcase, watched him with curiosity. His hair was perfectly combed, and his sneakers gleamed as if they had never touched the ground. Pedro felt his inquisitive gaze, but didn't look up. Then the boy's mother took his hand firmly and pulled him a few steps away, as if Pedro were contagious. She whispered something into her son's ear, and Pedro didn't need to hear it to know what she was saying. A burning sensation spread through his chest. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him that way, as if his mere presence were a problem. Minutes passed, and the murmur of the airport continued undisturbed. Pedro tried to distract himself by watching the planes take off and land when, a few meters away, he heard a stifled laugh. "Did you see the troublesome orphan?" An airline employee said in a low voice, but loud enough for Pedro to hear. His co-worker let out a muffled chuckle. Poor kid. Did he think crying would get him a free seat? Pedro felt his skin burn. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white from the pressure. He wanted to stand up, he wanted to scream in their faces, he wanted to tell them they knew nothing about him, that he wasn't just a troublesome orphan. But he didn't. He couldn't. His shoulders slowly slumped. He lowered his head, letting his hair fall over his face. He pretended not to have heard. He pretended not to care. But he did care. And it hurt. Helplessness consumed him like a slow fire. He gritted his teeth, trying to swallow his rage. He knew that if he said anything, if he made the slightest sound, he would only give them more reasons to mock him. So he stayed still. He pressed the Ronaldo shirt against his chest, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. He had no other choice. But inside him, a promise took shape with the force of a hurricane. Someday, he would make them swallow their words. Pedro clenched his teeth. Nothing will go wrong, they had told him at the foundation. They had promised it with a smile and a pat on the shoulder. But now everything was ruined. He looked at the runway through the glass. The plane was gone. His only chance to attend the event, to meet his idol, to feel for the first time that he belonged somewhere, had disappeared into the sky. He took a deep breath. He couldn't just stay there lamenting. Ronaldo wasn't just a player. He was someone who kept his word. If the foundation had invited him, Then they weren't going to abandon him. He had to do something. He looked around. People on their phones, hurried travelers, indifferent employees. He didn't have a phone, but he had the invitation letter with the foundation's number. He approached a middle-aged woman who was checking her phone. "Excuse me, could you lend me your phone for a moment? It's urgent." His voice trembled, but he held her gaze. She assessed him with suspicion. He wore a dirty t-shirt, his face was tense, and his eyes were red from crying. She was about to refuse, but something in the boy's expression made her hesitate. She sighed and handed him the phone. Pedro quickly dialed the numbers. The ringing sounded 3 times before a voice answered on the other end. "Cristiano Ronaldo Foundation, how can we help you?" "I'm Pedro Oliveira. I had a flight for the event, but they didn't let me board. I need help." There was a silence. Then, the sound of rapid typing. "Pedro, stay on the line. We're going to fix this." Pedro closed his eyes. Maybe there was still hope. As he waited, a man a few meters away pulled out his phone and pointed the camera at him. Pedro was sitting on the floor, hugging his legs, his eyes fixed on an empty spot. The man recorded for a few seconds and typed a message. "Look at what they did to this child." He uploaded the video to social media. Pedro was still on the phone. A murmur of distant voices and more typing. Then the voice returned, now more serious. "Pedro, we're looking into what happened. Don't hang up." The wait dragged on. Pedro could hear his own breathing, uneven. Finally, the voice spoke again. "We're going to escalate this immediately. Stay close to your phone. Someone will contact you soon." "But what do I do now?" Pedro asked, his voice trembling. "Don't worry. You're not alone in this." The call ended with a soft click. Pedro slowly lowered the phone. He didn't have answers yet, but for the first time all night, he felt that maybe someone was actually listening. In less than a minute, the first comments on the video began to appear. In 5 minutes, people were already sharing it. In 10, outrage exploded. And Pedro still didn't know that the whole world was about to hear his story. Pedro remained motionless on the bench in the waiting area, his gaze fixed on the floor. His backpack, now without purpose, rested between his feet. He had no idea what was happening on the internet, of the thousands of comments erupting in his defense. To him, the world remained the same, cruel and deaf to his existence. No one would come looking for him. No one would realize he was still there. The airport's bustle continued around him, indifferent. Families laughed, passengers argued with staff. Children ran dragging rolling suitcases that buzzed against the polished floor. Pedro felt despair wrapping around him like a shadow, but he forced himself not to cry anymore. He had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. A figure stopped in front of him. A janitor, dressed in a worn blue uniform and a faded cap, watched him in silence. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask. He simply took a tissue from his pants pocket and extended it to him. Pedro looked at him, surprised by the gesture, before taking it with trembling hands. The man nodded slightly and continued with his work, pushing his cleaning cart without looking back. Pedro clenched the tissue in his fist. It didn't mean much, but it wasn't nothing either. Thousands of kilometers away in Portugal, Cristiano Ronaldo was checking his phone between training sessions. His schedule was packed, sponsor commitments, meetings with his team, preparation for the charity event. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until a message appeared on the screen. "We have a problem with a boy who was supposed to arrive at the event." His jaw tightened. His eyes scanned the information quickly, absorbing every detail. He didn't move immediately, but his posture shifted. His muscles, still warm from exercise, tensed. The room fell silent when he placed the phone on the table with a sharp thud. He looked at his team. Ronaldo brought the phone to his ear. 3 rings. 4. Finally, a voice answered on the other end. "Good afternoon. This is the director of operations for—" "What the hell is going on?" Ronaldo interrupted, his voice sharp as a knife. "I want a clear answer. Now." An uncomfortable silence followed before the man tried to explain with evasions. Procedures, documentation, a misunderstanding. Empty words. "Stop giving me excuses." Ronaldo gripped the phone tightly. "There's a child alone and abandoned at an airport. A child you have failed. I'll make this simple. I want him on a plane in the next hour. Mr. Ronaldo, please understand there are protocols." "I'm going there." His voice left no room for argument. He hung up without waiting for another word. He turned to his assistant. "Call my driver. We're going to the airport right now." Ronaldo kept the phone clenched in his hand, his knuckles white from pressure. His breathing was heavy, every muscle in his body tense. The chair behind him wobbled as he stood up abruptly, scraping against the floor with such force that it nearly toppled over. He didn't care. He dialed another number with quick, precise movements. This time, there would be no excuses. Someone had to give him answers, and if not, he would tear them out himself. "Pick up," he muttered, pacing back and forth like a caged predator. From the doorway, Georgina watched him in silence. She had seen Cristiano upset before, but this was different. His jaw was so tight it looked like his teeth might break with just a little more pressure. He didn't need to speak for her to know he was furious. She walked toward him calmly, without making a sound. When she reached his side, she simply placed her hand on his arm. A simple gesture, a barely perceptible touch. But enough. He stopped, exhaled sharply. He didn't look at her, but he nodded. She said nothing. She didn't need to. At the airport, the atmosphere was that of any ordinary day. Passengers moved back and forth. Employees went about their tasks without urgency. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until it was. The first to notice were the security guards, then the airline staff, and after that, practically everyone in the area. A convoy of dark vehicles pulled up at the entrance. The rear door of one of them opened immediately, and several people emerged from inside. Assistants, private security, men with earpieces and alert expressions. They all moved with efficiency, as if each one knew exactly what they had to do. But it wasn't them who drew attention. It was him. Cristiano Ronaldo walked with firm steps toward the airport entrance. His face was a mask of determination. His presence changed everything. A murmur spread among the employees. Passengers pulled out their phones. Some people simply stood frozen. The cameras turned on. The recordings began. The world was about to see what would happen next. The supervisor felt a chill run down his spine as he saw who was crossing the main door. His face, once tense and authoritative, lost all color. Cristiano Ronaldo advanced with firm steps, his eyes sharp as blades. Around him, a group of assistants and bodyguards moved in perfect synchronization, clearing the path without a single word. The terminal, bustling just seconds before, fell into a sepulchral silence. Just a few meters behind, a journalist who had been at the airport for an unimportant assignment reacted quickly. His instinct screamed that something big was about to happen. With trembling fingers, he turned on his camera and adjusted the lens. His heart pounded as he positioned himself to capture every detail. He knew he had an exclusive in his hands. Ronaldo did not stop. His footsteps echoed over the marble floor. His gaze went straight to the employees who had ignored Pedro. One of them swallowed hard and took an unconscious step back. Another, a middle-aged woman, looked down at the floor as if she wanted to disappear. But there was no escape. The weight of reality crushed them. Passengers began taking out their phones. The murmurs grew in intensity. Some recognized the journalist and understood that something major was happening. Ronaldo stopped right in front of the airline counter. He placed both hands on the surface and looked directly at the supervisor. His expression remained impassive, but a contained fury burned in his eyes. The supervisor tried to speak, but his voice broke on the first syllable. He swallowed hard and straightened his posture. He knew he was in trouble, but he had no idea how deep. Cristiano Ronaldo did not blink. His jaw tightened. Then he spoke. His voice was nothing more than a deep murmur, but in the boarding area, it sounded like thunder. "Explain to me what happened with Pedro." Now, Pedro blinks several times. His breathing is uneven. It can't be real. But there he is, tall, imposing, with that determined look he has seen hundreds of times on television. Cristiano Ronaldo has come for him. The murmurs around him fade. The entire airport seems to hold its breath. Pedro feels his own heart pounding in his chest. He doesn't move. He doesn't dare to speak. He just watches, eyes wide, his stomach in knots. Ronaldo takes a step forward. His voice cuts through the silence like a knife. "Where is the child?" There are no shouts, no hysteria. Just a clear, cold command. The airline employees exchange nervous glances. No one wants to be the first to speak. Pedro watches as some of them step back, shrinking into their uniforms. The supervisor who had rejected him earlier lowers his gaze and presses his lips together. His already pale skin turns ashen. He knows there is no escape. This is not just a footballer. He is a symbol, and he has just turned against him. Before anyone can respond, a man in a dark suit bursts onto the scene. The urgency is evident in his clumsy movements, his shirt soaked in sweat, his breath ragged from running. A high-ranking airline executive. The situation has escalated faster than he could have foreseen. "Mr. Ronaldo, we can offer you an immediate flight." His voice trembles. He tries to smile, but it is an empty gesture, devoid of conviction. "We can fix this misunderstanding right away." Ronaldo does not blink. He shows not the slightest change in expression. His gaze remains fixed on the employees who had ignored Pedro, on those who had laughed, on those who had left him alone. The executive wipes his forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. "We'll fix it, I assure you. Just tell us what we can do." Ronaldo did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the airline executive, whose labored breathing betrayed his desperation. The footballer did not blink. His stone-like face conveyed a message clearer than any words. Silence spread through the airport lobby, turning into an unbearable weight for those waiting for a reaction. The camera flashes flickered incessantly. The tension grew with every passing second. The airline employees exchanged nervous glances. The situation had completely slipped out of their control. What had started as a minor issue had turned into an international scandal. Some tried to disappear into the crowd, while others remained frozen, unable to decide whether they should act or simply wait for it all to be over. The supervisor, who minutes earlier had treated Pedro with indifference, now looked paler than the marble floor. Ronaldo finally moved his head and walked toward Pedro. The child, still trembling, looked at him with wide, red-rimmed eyes. The footballer leaned down and spoke to him in a slow but firm voice. "Did they treat you well?" Pedro swallowed, hesitated for a moment, and then shook his head. He did not utter a word, but his response was more than enough. Ronaldo clenched his jaw. The tension in his face was evident. His gaze hardened even more, and his fingers briefly curled into a fist before relaxing. He did not need to say anything else. His expression said it all. Someone was going to pay for this. Ronaldo did not say a word. He simply took off his jacket and placed it over Pedro's shoulders. The child felt the weight of the warm, heavy fabric wrapping around him. But more than that, he felt something he could not quite describe. It was not just the garment, it was the gesture. It was the first time in a long while that someone had done something for him, without expecting anything in return. The air in the terminal grew thick. No one dared to move or break the silence, which had now become a deafening void. Pedro lowered his gaze, his fingers gripping the fabric of the jacket. He had spent too much time feeling invisible, as if he did not matter. But now, at this moment, in front of everyone, he felt that someone truly saw him. One of the employees, a middle-aged man whose face was tense from the pressure of the moment, swallowed hard and stepped forward. His voice trembled slightly as he tried to justify himself. "We were just following the rules." Ronaldo looked directly at him, unblinking, and interrupted him with a firm voice. "The rules should not prevent doing what is right." The employee averted his gaze to the floor. There was nothing more he could say. Deep down, everyone knew that what had happened was wrong. And now, the most influential person in the room was making it clear. Around them, other employees exchanged anxious looks. They knew this would not be forgotten anytime soon. The phone cameras were still raised, capturing every second of the moment. Social media was already ablaze with the story, and now they had undeniable proof that they had made a mistake, one that would not be fixed with a simple apology. Pedro felt a lump in his throat. He looked at Ronaldo, who remained beside him, strong and unwavering. For the first time in a long time, he felt that he was not alone, that someone had taken his side without hesitation, without excuses, without rules getting in the way. The employee lowers his gaze. His breathing is irregular, and his face is pale. He tries to say something else, but the words get caught in his throat. The intensity of Ronaldo's stare weighs on him, paralyzing him. In the end, he only manages to let out an incomprehensible murmur before looking away, defeated. A journalist, who has been capturing the scene from the beginning, brings his camera closer to the employee's face. His hands tremble slightly, sensing the tension of the moment. The lens focuses on Ronaldo's face, his expression hardened by restrained indignation. Every word, every gesture is recorded in high definition. The silence in the terminal is almost absolute. Only the hum of recording equipment and the click of a few cameras breaking the stillness. Then, Ronaldo takes a step forward and places a firm hand on Pedro's shoulder. The boy looks up at him, saying nothing, his eyes still red. Ronaldo raises his gaze and, in a clear and controlled voice, declares, "This boy only wanted a little hope, and you denied it to him." The words hang in the air like an unappealable verdict. The cameras miss nothing. Some employees lower their heads. Others glance around nervously, aware that everything is being broadcast to the world. The journalist presses his lips together, feeling that he has just captured a moment that will define the airline's history. Pedro, standing next to Ronaldo, feels something different inside. For the first time in a long while, he is not invisible. Pedro felt the firmness of Ronaldo's hand on his shoulder. It was not just a gesture, it was a shield. The warmth of his palm seeped through the fabric of his jacket, dissolving the cold that had accompanied him all day. For hours, Pedro had been invisible, an obstacle to bureaucracy. Now before him stood someone who not only saw him, but defended him. The silence in the airport was dense. It was not the usual noise of travelers' announcements and airplane engines. It was a different kind of silence, an uncomfortable one. A murmur swept through the terminal. At first it was just a few whispers, then more voices joined in. The airline employees exchanged nervous glances. Some lowered their heads, others struggled to maintain their composure, clutching their notebooks or screens as if they were anchors. The cameras kept rolling. Passengers' phones were raised in the air like silent witnesses. Every eye was on Ronaldo and Pedro. And then it exploded. Social media caught fire. The video of the confrontation, captured in high definition by a journalist, spread like wildfire through a dry forest. In less than 5 minutes, posts were accumulating thousands of comments. Hashtag Justice for Pedro topped the trending lists. Users from all over the world condemned the airline with messages filled with outrage. They demanded explanations. They demanded change. They demanded that someone be held accountable for what had been done to the boy. The airline's official accounts scrambled to contain the damage, but every response was met with more anger. The comments were relentless, unacceptable, monstrous. Ronaldo did what you couldn't. In the airport, the murmur swelled into a wall of voices. Some passengers looked at Pedro with empathy, others with shame. Ronaldo did not move. He did not remove his hand from Pedro's shoulder. He did not look away from those who had ignored him, because now the world was watching too. Social media exploded. Within minutes, the hashtag Justice for Pedro flooded Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. It wasn't just ordinary users who joined the outrage, but also celebrities, journalists, and activists from around the world. The case transcended borders. Videos, images, and comments demanded answers. Some showed Pedro's face, his eyes filled with tears in the boarding area. Others highlighted Ronaldo's arrival at the airport, confronting the staff with a gaze that radiated determination. Pedro, however, had no idea what was happening online. For him, everything boiled down to the moment he was living. The warmth of Ronaldo's hand on his shoulder gave him a sense of security he had never felt before. He looked at him with a mixture of admiration and gratitude, but also disbelief. Was this really happening? His mind still couldn't process the magnitude of what was unfolding around him. The crowd, the cameras, the murmurs. He only saw Ronaldo and the relief of not being alone. The chaos within the airline became unsustainable. The criticism intensified across all platforms, and the executives had no choice but to react. In a live broadcast, the company's public relations director appeared on camera with a tense expression. "We want to express our sincerest apologies to Pedro for what happened. We take full responsibility and have arranged a private flight so he can reach his destination immediately." The air in the airport grew heavier. Everyone was waiting for Ronaldo's response. It didn't take long. "I don't trust you with him." His tone was icy, his expression impenetrable. "Pedro will travel with me. Period." Silence fell over the terminal like an unbearable weight. The airline executives were paralyzed. They knew there was nothing left they could do to salvage their image. The damage was done, and the whole world was watching in real time. The airline CEO cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward the microphone. His hands trembled, barely perceptible, but enough for the cameras to capture his discomfort. The conference room was packed, with journalists holding up their recorders, waiting for every word. The pressure was suffocating. He swallowed hard, his unsteady breathing amplified by the microphone. He knew every word would be analyzed, every gesture dissected. There was no room for error. "We want to express our sincerest apologies to Pedro," he said, his voice tense. "What happened was unacceptable and does not reflect the values of our company." A murmur spread through the room. No one seemed convinced. Pedro, a few meters away, watched the scene without fully understanding. Never in his life had anyone raised their voice for him. No one had ever stood up to powerful people to demand justice on his behalf. And now there was Ronaldo, arms crossed, imposing, as if every fiber of his being radiated determination. He wasn't just a football idol. He was someone willing to fight for him without expecting anything in return. The CEO looked away from Ronaldo and turned back to the audience. The pressure in his chest intensified. "We have offered Pedro a private flight, all expenses covered, and compensation to make up for this unfortunate incident." Ronaldo didn't even blink. He took a microphone and spoke coldly. "I don't trust you with him." Silence fell. No one dared to breathe. The airline CEO sank into his chair, defeated. Pedro felt a lump in his throat. The mix of emotions overwhelmed him. He didn't know what to say, what to think. He only knew that he had never felt this before. Safety. Protection. Minutes later, on the private runway, Pedro boarded Ronaldo's jet. The interior was luxurious, far more than he had imagined. But that wasn't what mattered. It was the certainty that he was leaving behind more than just an airport. He was leaving behind a part of his life that no longer belonged to him. The plane began to move. Pedro looked out the window and watched the city lights stretching beneath him. His heart was racing, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was something different, something new. He whispered, without taking his eyes off the world he was leaving behind. "Thank you." Pedro looked at Ronaldo, his eyes still reflecting astonishment. Everything had happened so fast. Hours ago, he was trapped in hopelessness, and now he was on a private plane with his idol. Ronaldo smiled at him, a sincere smile, filled with something more than mere sympathy. He reached out and gently ruffled his hair. "It's not over yet, Pedro," said the footballer, his voice firm but warm. "This is just the beginning." Pedro didn't respond. He only nodded, processing those words. The boy didn't fully understand what they meant, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the future. He wasn't sure what awaited him, but he knew he wasn't alone. He let himself sink into the leather seat, feeling his body exhausted. His clothes were dirty, the sleeves of his coat frayed, and the dust from the airport still clung to his worn-out sneakers. But none of that mattered now. His heart was pounding, as if something inside him had ignited, as if something that had been dormant for years had finally awakened. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the plane and Ronaldo's calm breathing beside him envelop him. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. Hours later, the charity event was unfolding in a luxurious hall, filled with bright lights and an expectant crowd. Pedro observed everything from a corner, uncomfortable yet curious. There were children like him, some his age, others younger. They were all smiling. Some were even laughing. It seemed impossible that just a day ago he had been alone in an airport with no one to stand up for him. Then someone called him to the stage. Pedro hesitated, but Ronaldo gave him a nod. He trusted him. He walked to the center, feeling the eyes of the crowd on him. "Pedro," announced a man in an elegant suit, "we want to give you something that will change your life." The boy frowned. He didn't understand. Then the man held out an envelope. Pedro took it with trembling hands and opened it. Inside, there was a document with his name. A full scholarship, education, housing, everything covered. He looked up, stunned. The man kept speaking, but Pedro barely heard him. He only caught the last thing he said. "You will never be alone again." Pedro felt something in his chest, a strange, warm sensation he didn't remember ever feeling before. He looked at Ronaldo, who winked at him. And then he smiled. A real smile. For the first time in a long time, he believed in something. In a future. In himself. The stage lights shone on Pedro with a glare that almost blinded him. The auditorium roared with applause, but he only had eyes for the man standing in front of him. Cristiano Ronaldo extended the symbolic diploma, his eyes reflecting something more than mere pride. Pedro took it with both hands and pressed it against his chest with such force that it almost hurt. His fingers trembled. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the end of a struggle he never thought he would win. The echo of the applause surrounded him, but his mind was elsewhere. His breathing was unsteady, as if the weight of everything he had lived through was trying to crush him at that very moment. Ronaldo leaned slightly and whispered, "This is just the beginning, Pedro." Pedro looked up. In Ronaldo's eyes, there was no condescension, only an absolute certainty that this moment was not an act of charity, but the starting point of something greater, something he couldn't fully understand yet, but that was beginning to ignite like a spark within his chest. He slowly turned his head toward the audience. Among the dozens of cheering faces, a flicker caught his attention. His heart stopped for a second. There, among the lights of the auditorium, he thought he saw a face he knew all too well. His mother. His breath caught in his throat. He blinked, but the image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His mind was playing tricks on him. He knew she wasn't there. She couldn't be. And yet, the feeling of her presence was so strong that his skin bristled. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the stage lights surrounded him once more, and the roar of the applause brought him back to reality. He wasn't alone. Not this time. Not ever again. He smiled for the first time without fear. His mother wasn't there, but in his heart, he knew he had done it for her.